Picture yourself in 1535, and you are standing in the nave of a chilled stone church in Yorkshire, surrounded by the scent of beeswax candles and damp wool, about to commit an act that will legally erase you from the face of the earth. To the casual observer, this is a celebration, a union of two prosperous merchant families, a moment of joy and fertility. But if you could see the invisible ink of the English common law hovering in the air like a suffocating fog, you would see a very different scene playing out. You are 19 years old, a young woman of sharp intelligence and considerable skill, the daughter of a wool merchant who has spent the last decade teaching you the intricate art of the trade. You know how to run your fingers through a fleece to detect the subtle grit that lowers its value. You know how to haggle with the hard-bitten shepherd of the dales. You know how to balance a ledger until columns of ink march in perfect order. You are not a helpless child. You are a businesswoman in all but name, wearing a gown of imported velvet that you purchase with coins earned by your own hand, carrying a leather purse at your waist heavy with silver groats you have saved, coin by coin, for 5 years. But as the priest's voice drones the Latin liturgy and the man beside you, a stranger chosen by your father, takes your hand, the great iron trap of history begins to creak shut. He slides a gold ring onto your finger, and in that heartbeat, the person you were vanishes. It is not a metaphor. It is not poetry. It is the cold, hard reality of the doctrine of coverture. The woman who walked into this church, the legal entity who could own, sign, negotiate, and possess, has died. In her place stands a Feme Covert, a covered woman, a shadow entity who exists solely as an extension of the man standing beside her. The silver in your purse? It is his now. The velvet on your back? He holds a title to it. The 200-pound dowry your father paid, a fortune that could buy a large estate, it belongs to him, to spend, to save, or to gamble away at the card tables of London. You have not just married a man, you have been swallowed by him. This was the terrifying reality of life for half the population in Tudor England, a reality that history books, obsessed with the wars of men and the intrigues of kings, have conveniently glossed over. We stare in fascination at Henry VIII, the bloated tyrant who famously severed the heads of 2 of his queens, regarding him as a unique monster. Yet we fail to see that he was merely the most visible enforcer of a legal system that monstered women every single day. The axe was a rare punishment. Coverture was a daily sentence. This law, which defined the lives of millions of women for centuries, was based on a legal fiction so absolute it borders on surreal. The concept of the unity of person. The great legal theorist William Blackstone would later summarize it with chilling simplicity. By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage. One person, and that person was the husband. Imagine the psychological violence of that erasure. You do not merely lose your property, you lose your voice. You cannot sign a contract. If you have a brilliant idea for a new way to weave cloth or a new trade route to exploit, you cannot legally pursue it. If you sign a document, it is as void as if a child or a madman had scrawled an X upon the parchment. You cannot sue a neighbor who steals your chickens. You cannot take a debtor to court who refuses to pay for the ale you brewed. You cannot even agree to sell the eggs from your own backyard without your husband's tacit consent. You become a ghost in your own life, haunting the domestic spaces of your home, physically present but legally invisible. To understand the sheer scale of this injustice, we must strip away the romance of the Tudor aesthetic, the ruffs, the lutes, the banquets, and look at the raw economics of survival. In 1535, survival was a brutal business. A skilled craftsman might earn £5 or £6 in a year of toil. A wealthy merchant's daughter might bring a dowry of £200. This was an astronomical sum, enough to alter the destiny of a family line. Now, consider the transaction that took place before the wedding. Picture a meeting in a smoke-filled tavern or quiet parlor, weeks before the ceremony. 2 fathers sit opposite one another, clutching goblets of wine, documents spread on the oak table between them. They are not discussing the happiness of their children. They are not asking if the girl loved the boy, or if the boy respects the girl. They are negotiating a merger. "My daughter brings £200 in ready coin," says the first man, the wool merchant. "She also brings linens, pewter plate, and household goods valued at another £30. She is healthy, of childbearing hips and obedient. The second man, the groom's father, nods, calculating. He looks at the girl not as a human soul, but as a bundle of assets. "Very well," he replies. "In exchange, I will settle a jointure upon her. If my son dies before her, she shall have the use of 1/3 of our lands in Kent for her lifetime." It is a business deal, cold and precise. The daughter is the currency. In this moment, her humanity is secondary to her value as a vehicle for transferring wealth from one patriarch to another. For the young woman waiting in the hallway, listening to the heavy oak door, this commodification was a source of profound, silent anxiety. She knew, with a certainty that we can scarcely imagine, that her value in the world was quantified. A sister with a larger dowry was worth more. A sister with a scandalous reputation was damaged goods, like a bolt of cloth left out in the rain. And if the family fortune failed, if a ship sank in the channel, if a fire consumed the warehouse, her value plummeted to zero. Without a dowry, she was unmarketable. She would become a burden, a spinster aunt living on the charity of resentful brothers, trapped in a state of perpetual childhood, governed first by her father and then by her male relatives. But surely, you might think, the law protected her from abuse? Surely, if her husband was a tyrant, the crown offered some recourse? The answer, tragically, is almost entirely no. The law of coverture gave the husband chastisement rights. He was legally permitted to beat his wife, provided the correction was not lethal or permanently maiming. If he broke her bones, the law might frown. If he bruised her face, the law shrugged. It was a private matter, a domestic governance issue, much like a master disciplining a servant. If she fled his house to escape his fists, he could legally force her return. If she took her own clothes with her when she ran, he could have her charged with theft. For remember, she owned nothing, not even the dress on her back. To steal the clothes she wore was to steal his property. The entrapment was total. This was the system that Henry VIII manipulated with such terrifying dexterity. We often view Henry's great matter, his divorce from Katherine of Aragon, as a religious or romantic drama. But look closer, and you will see it was a brutal exercise in coverture and property law on the highest stage imaginable. Katherine of Aragon was not just a victim of a fickle man. She was a victim of a legal system that viewed her as an asset that had failed to perform. When she arrived in England in 1501 to marry Henry's brother Arthur, she brought a dowry of 200,000 crowns, a treasure chest of gold plate and jewels that represented the wealth of the Spanish Empire. When Arthur died months later, that gold became the subject of a bitter 7-year dispute between Henry VII and Catherine's father, Ferdinand of Spain. Catherine was the hostage in the middle. For 7 years, the Princess of Spain lived in Durham House on the Strand, often unable to pay her servants, wearing mended dresses, eating simple food, writing desperate letters to her father begging for aid. She was a piece of disputed inventory, stuck in a warehouse, waiting for men to decide who owned the bill of lading. When Henry VIII finally married her, he covered her. He took her person, her loyalty, and her remaining rights. And when he decided to discard her, he used the full weight of the law to crush her identity. The erasure of Katherine of Aragon is one of the most harrowing chapters in the history of English law. On July 11th, 1533, the Pope's authority was cast aside, and Henry declared his marriage to Catherine void. But he did not just divorce her. He demoted her. He stripped her of the title of queen, reducing her to Princess Dowager, the title she held as Arthur's widow. It was a deliberate, legal humiliation. He commanded that her household be broken up, her income slashed, her badge of the pomegranate ripped from the livery of her servants. He forbade her from seeing her only child, Mary. Think of the cruelty of that separation. A mother and daughter, both fiercely intelligent, both devout, kept apart by the king's command, used as leverage against one another. If Catherine would only sign the oath acknowledging the illegitimacy of her marriage, she could see Mary. If she refused, she would die alone. Catherine, with a spine of steel, refused to sign away her honor. She died in Kimbolton Castle in 1536, isolated, possibly poisoned, but certainly broken by a system that had turned her from the highest woman in the land into a non-person. The message sent to the women of England was clear and terrifying. If the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, Diana the Holy Roman Emperor, a woman of royal blood and unblemished virtue, could be discarded like a worn-out glove because she failed to produce a son, then no woman was safe. The merchant's wife in Cheapside, the farmer's wife in the muddy fields of Essex, the noblewoman in the silken corridors of court, all felt the chill. Their security depended entirely on the goodwill of their husbands and the unpredictable lottery of biology. And let us speak of that biology, for it was the engine that drove the anxiety of the age. In the Tudor mind, conception was a mystery, but the burden of the outcome lay squarely on the woman. A wife who bore only daughters was considered to have failed in her primary duty. It was not seen as a roll of the genetic dice, but as a moral or physical failing of the mother. Henry VIII's obsession with a male heir was not unique. It was a national neurosis writ large. Every man with a scrap of land or a pewter pot to leave behind wanted a son to carry his name. Primogeniture, the right of the firstborn son to inherit the estate, meant that daughters were structural weaknesses in the family line. They siphoned off wealth and dowries, but could not carry the name forward. A family with 6 daughters and no sons was a family facing economic extinction. The pressure on women to breed, and to breed sons, was crushing. Childbirth was the leading cause of death for young women. To enter confinement chamber, the room with the windows sealed and the tapestries drawn, was to step onto a battlefield from which many never returned. Women wrote their wills before giving birth. They said their goodbyes. And yet, if they survived and held a girl child in their arms, they saw not relief in their husband's eyes, but disappointment. This was the emotional landscape of coverture, a legal non-existence compounded by a biological imperative that could kill you. But the assault on women's autonomy in the 1530s was not limited to the marriage bed. Henry's break with Rome unleashed another catastrophe: the dissolution of the monasteries. We are taught this was a religious reform, a cleansing of corrupt monks. But for women, it was a disaster of apocalyptic proportions. For centuries, the convent had been the only alternative to marriage. If a woman did not wish to be covered by a husband, if she wished to pursue a life of study, of prayer, of administration, or simply a female community, the nunnery was her refuge. In the convent, a woman could be a person. She could vote in the chapter house. She could hold office. She could learn Latin, read philosophy, and manage estates. Consider the abbess of a great house like Shaftesbury or Barking. These women were titans. They were barons in their own right. The abbess of Barking took precedence over other barons in the House of Lords. She managed thousands of acres of land, sat as a judge in her own manorial courts, hired bailiffs, and balanced books that dealt in thousands of pounds.
She answered to no man but the Pope and the King. She was the ultimate femme soul, a woman alone, powerful and independent. Then came Thomas Cromwell and the King's Commissioners. Between 1536 and 1540, this alternative world was smashed to pieces. The commissioners arrived at the convent gates with soldiers and hammers. They demanded the surrender of the abbey seal, the symbol of the community's legal corporate identity. When the abbess handed over that seal, she was signing the death warrant of her way of life. The nuns were evicted, forced out of their cloisters, and back into a world that had no place for them. Where could they go? They could not marry, for their vows to God were still considered binding by their own consciences, even if the king said otherwise. They could not return to their families, who had already paid their dowries to the church and had no wish to support them again. They were cast adrift. The pensions granted to them were meager, far less than those given to the monks. Many nuns, particularly the older ones who had lived in the cloister for 40 years, fell into abject poverty. We find their traces in the parish records, shadowy figures living in rented rooms, selling their embroidery for bread, petitioning the crown for pensions that were years in arrears. The destruction of the monasteries was the destruction of the only institutional structure in England that allowed women to govern themselves. It was a closing of the door, a final reinforcement of the idea that a woman's only proper place was in the home, under the thumb of a husband. The intellectual light of the convents was snuffed out, and it would be centuries before women in England would again have access to that kind of communal, autonomous education. The atmosphere of the 1530s and 40s was thick with paranoia and for women, speech itself became a dangerous weapon. The Treason Act of 1534 was a terrifying piece of legislation because it criminalized not just acts, but words. And not just public speeches, but malicious words spoken in private. This brought the terror of the state into the kitchen and the bedchamber.
Servants were encouraged to inform on their mistresses. Children were questioned about their parents. A woman sitting at her spinning wheel, whispering to a neighbor that she pitied the good Queen Katherine, or that she thought Anne Boleyn had a goggle eye, could be arrested for treason. This was not a theoretical threat. Women died for it. The Countess of Salisbury, Margaret Pole, was one of the wealthiest women in England, a Plantagenet relic of the old royal blood. She was 67 years old, a frail yet formidable matriarch. Henry viewed her existence as a threat. She was imprisoned in the Tower of London for 2 years, stripped of her comforts, suffering from the cold, having no tunic to wear but a rag. In 1541, she was dragged to the block. The execution was botched. The headsman, young and inexperienced, hacked at her shoulder and neck before finally ending her life. It was a butchery that shocked the courts of Europe, but it served its purpose. It terrified nobility into silence. If the king's own cousin, an elderly grandmother, could be hacked to death on the green, who was safe? Lower down the social scale, women like the Nun of Kent, Elizabeth Barton, were executed for prophesying against the king's marriage. Anne Askew, a woman of sharp intellect and Protestant conviction, was tortured on the rack, a device rarely used on women, before being burned at the stake in 1546. Her crime was preaching a faith that differed from the king's, but her deeper crime was refusing to be silent, refusing to let her mind be covered by the state. Yet, in this landscape of total legal subjugation, there was one loophole, one strange and morbid gateway to freedom: death. Specifically, the death of the husband. The moment a man died, the heavy blanket of coverture was lifted. The widow emerged from the funeral gloom as a legal entity once more. Suddenly, the Feme Covert became the Feme Soul. The transformation was startling. A widow could sign contracts. She could own property in her own name. She could run a business. She could sue and be sued. For many women, widowhood was the first time in their adult lives that they tasted genuine agency, and the records show that they seized it with both hands. Walk through the archives of Tudor London, and you will meet the widows. You will find widows running major printing presses, deciding which books to publish. You'll find widows running breweries, dominating the ale trade. You will find widows managing fleets of trading ships. There is the story of Katherine Fenkel, a draper's widow who took over her husband's vast trading empire. She didn't just maintain it, she expanded it. She traded cloth with the Netherlands, managed apprentices, and became a fierce negotiator in the London courts. She was wealthy, powerful, and respected. But note the precondition of her power. Her husband had to be dead. It is a grim irony that a woman's best hope for freedom lay in the grave of her spouse. But this freedom was precarious. A widow was a target. She was a ship floating in shark-infested waters. If she had money, every man in her vicinity wanted to marry her to get his hands on it. The pressure to remarry was relentless. The guilds didn't like women running businesses. They often pressured widows to marry a journeyman or another master to bring the shop back under male control. Neighbors whispered that a woman living alone was unnatural, unguarded, perhaps immoral. And if she did succumb, if she fell in love, or she simply grew tired of fighting the world alone and accepted a proposal, the trap snapped shut again. The moment she said, "I do," to a second husband, Katherine Fenkel, the powerful merchant, would vanish. Her ships, her gold, her contracts, all would instantly become the property of the new man. She would return to the status of a child. Many widows, knowing this, fought tooth and nail to remain single. They wrote wills binding their property in complex trust to try and keep it out of the hands of future husbands. They chose independence over companionship because in Tudor England, you could not have both. This system of coverture did not die with Henry VIII. It did not die with Elizabeth I, who famously declared herself married to England to avoid the legal subjugation of a husband. It persisted, stubborn and rot-like, at the heart of English law for centuries. It crossed the ocean to the American colonies. It shaped the lives of women in the Victorian era. It was not until the late 19th century, the 1870s and 1880s, that the Married Women's Property Acts began to dismantle the legal fiction that a wife was possession. Think about that timeline. The concept that a married woman was a non-person legally existed longer than the Roman Empire. It existed while Shakespeare wrote, while Newton discovered gravity, while the steam engine was invented. Generations of women lived, labored, and died within this invisible prison. They were the silent partners of history. The women who managed the farms while men were at war. The women who kept the shops running while the men were in the tavern. The women who brewed the beer, spun the wool, and raised a nation, all while possessing fewer rights than a convicted felon. When we look back at the Tudor era, we are dazzled by the jewels and the bloodshed. We see the drama of the court, the 6 wives, the break with Rome. But the real story, the story that touched every single household in the realm, is the story of coverture. It is the story of the law that turned love into a property transfer and marriage into a confiscation. It is a story that requires us to look past the famous queens and see the millions of shadows standing behind them. The merchant's daughter in Yorkshire, the evicted nun in Barking, the terrified wife in Cheapside. These women were not passive victims. They were survivors in a system designed to erase them. They found ways to hide coins in their hems, to whisper secrets in the market, to run businesses from behind the scenes, to keep their souls alive even when the law said they did not exist. Their resilience is the true marvel of the age. We have abolished the laws, but we must not abolish the memory. The legal death they suffered was real, and the silence they left behind is deafening. It is our duty, hundreds of years later, to break that silence, to read between the lines of the court rolls, and to remember the women who were legally dead while they were still breathing. This was their reality. And in understanding it, we see the Tudor world not as a pageant of kings, but as a battlefield of rights where the war was fought not with swords, but with statutes inside the very homes of the English people. If you are haunted by the ghosts of these forgotten women, if you see the shadow of coverture stretching across the centuries, then you understand why we must keep digging. The archives are full of these stories, waiting for the dust to be blown away. History is not just what is written in the books of kings. It is what was endured in the silence of the ordinary. Every subscription, every shared video helps us amplify these voices that the law tried to strangle. There are more stories to tell. Stories of women who fought back. Stories of crimes hidden in the ledger books. Stories of the dark underbelly of the Golden Age. Join us as we uncover them. The past is never dead. It is not even past.